It's been over a decade since the launch of the four foundational CRISPR companies. What lessons have we learned from their strategic decisions and the impact it has on other platform companies? Plus, AbbVie is the latest pharma to make its debut in the obesity space, and what FDA can do to bring rare disease innovation back to the US. We'll discuss all of this on today's BioCentury This Week. I'm Stephen Hansen, one of the directors of Biopharma Intelligence here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues,
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Lauren, you had a great story last week, a long story, 5 parts to it, which was fantastic to get that out last week. But it was looking at sort of the long-standing debate about whether platform companies should validate their technologies by first pursuing clinically or commercially validated targets, or whether they should aim for, greater value creation by going after new targets, putting all of this sort of on the background of the 4 foundational CRISPR companies. Can we start off with kind of what were the lessons that you learned here, in your opinion?
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I think to start off, this isn't going to settle the debate over whether a new platform should be taken into an established indication or target or a new one. It's going to depend on the technology. CRISPR-Cas9 was a very unique case because of the permanent nature of the changes that this tool can make to a patient's DNA. The risks were just so particularly high. I can say that the strategies that proved the most successful so far for CRISPR-Cas9 were the ones that were the most de-risked on the other dimensions, the targets, the indications, because the technology was so risky. I'll say that after speaking with the founding CEOs of each of these 4 companies, they all still stand by the approaches that they took, which each had a different level of risk and each worked out differently. So I guess to back up, there were these 4 companies that you mentioned: CRISPR Therapeutics, Intellia, Editas, and Caribou. Each of these companies had access to this CRISPR-Cas9 technology, and each of them focused on a different initial application, which is what makes it such an interesting case study for indication selection. And these really covered the applications that were possible with the technology at that time, given the challenges of delivering this. So CRISPR worked on ex vivo stem cell editing. Editas worked on in vivo lipid nanoparticles. Editas worked on AAVs to the eye, and Caribou worked on the CAR T-cell therapies. We have one company now, CRISPR Therapeutics, which has a program on the market, and Intellia has 3 phase 3 clinical programs. Caribou has a couple of CAR Ts in the clinic, and now Editas is back in preclinical development and has shifted gears a bit.
So, Lauren, what do you think the lessons were that were learned here from these 4 case studies that you did?
Yeah, I think looking back on the experience with the founding CEOs, I think one of the most common lessons learned across these 4 companies was not to underestimate the challenge of marrying a new technology, a new tool, with the established adjacent technology. So in this case, it was the delivery vehicles. Each person that I spoke with, cited tons of challenges that were unanticipated about applying CRISPR-Cas9 to LNPs or to edit stem cells ex vivo or to use them in AAV vectors. So that was one of the big lessons learned. I think another one, and this isn't unique to this platform, we hear it all the time, but it's bringing the CMC and the manufacturing work earlier in the development process. Roger Novak at CRISPR Therapeutics credits this with the ability of CRISPR to move so quickly through the clinic and onto the market once it got to that point. And I heard from multiple founding CEOs the challenges of making the purity assays and those different components that go into the development process, not necessarily the clinical development. So those were 2 big things that, beyond how to de-risk your indication selection, came up over and over again in these conversations.
I think being able to keep track of your mechanism of action as you move through development is another lesson that might have come out. So if you're going into an area where there's already some kind of genetic medicine in that particular indication, there might already be some established methodology for figuring out whether your thing is doing the thing it's designed to do, but that's harder when you're carving new territory. So I think there's like a little bit of a cautionary tale in there, but perhaps something that could be worked around if it was thought about in advance from the Editas tale. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think the Intellia story is a good example of sort of de-risking everything about that mechanism before you go in. So Nessun Birmingham explained exactly how Intellia made, what would be at the time the highest risk application for CRISPR-Cas9, which was delivering it systemically into a person, hoping that this is going to work where you want it to work and nowhere else. So to do that, they took the indications and the targets that other genetic medicines companies, Alnylam and Ionis, had already helped validate and, were in their pipeline. Whatever this means for commercial opportunity, it did take a lot of the risk, almost completely eliminated the target risk. And then for Editas, when I spoke with Katrine Bosley, she said that their entire founding principle was that there's no reason to take a new technology, a new modality, into an indication that can be addressed in the same way with a different established modality. So it was all about going into something entirely new. So that was what they did with their LCA10 program. And in that case, there were no animal models. The assays could only be done in a very specific cell type where you couldn't really do an assay. So I think it is a bit of a cautionary tale about pioneering therapies in a new indication with an entirely new technology, because when that happens, you don't have the right tools. It's hard to tell exactly how it works. And if something doesn't work, it's hard to tell why. And so, Birmingham would say that you need to de-risk and take all of those variables out to figure out what's going wrong and to improve the technology. So, he argues that it's actually a necessary step in developing new technology, taking it into that established indication.
It seems like a fair point. Because it seems like you're compounding the risk if you're taking multiple unknowns and going into one area. As you say, it's hard then to potentially tease out where the problem is, whether it's the underlying biology of the target, biology of the disease, the assays, or the technology itself.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And I think Editas, they picked a genetic indication where the target should have been relatively clear, even though it had never been targeted before. But then you run into these other issues, like Lauren was saying, they didn't have preclinical models. You can't biopsy retinal tissue to know if you're really expressing or not expressing. So if you're going that route, I think that probably a lot more work needs to go into thinking in advance about how you are going to keep track of that mechanism of action as you move forward.
It's also just about luck too. So at the time, I remember everyone you spoke with would say the eye is de-risked, it's immune privilege. If we make changes in the cells in the eye, they're going to only happen in the eye and there's no systemic risk. And the immune response to the Cas9 protein or to the viral vector that's being used to deliver it will be relatively limited because of that. That was the thinking at the time, that this was a relatively safe thing to do. What wasn't anticipated was the fact that you don't really want the CRISPR-Cas9 machinery to stick around. If you're delivering it with a viral vector, it's going to stay in the cells that you've delivered it into, which can compound those risks of, off-target editing or unanticipated genetic changes. And yeah, the immunogenicity of the Cas9 too. I think that was something that wasn't really anticipated, but this was a bacterial protein that we've since learned can trigger immune responses in patients. It was a really interesting story to discuss with Katrine.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Lauren. That story is available right now on biocentury.com. We'll take a quick break and be right back.
BioCentury This Week is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
We've had some fairly big news that dropped in the obesity space today. If any of you have been listening to our podcast for the past few years, you've probably caught on that this is a space that I've kind of really enjoyed covering as it's sort of exploded and become one of the next big market opportunities for biopharma. And based on the news today, AbbVie is the latest big pharma to jump into the obesity race. The details around the deal the company announced were with Danish biotech Gubra, in which AbbVie paid $350 million upfront for their phase 1 amylin agonist, with up to $1.9 billion in milestones. think this is an interesting deal to me. First off, because, AbbVie, they have the manufacturing know-how, they have the commercial track record to really make something into a success if they want to. And so I think when you think about sort of the big pharmas that weren't in obesity that could potentially come in, they're one of those ones that I think is pretty well positioned from the perspective that obesity is just as much about manufacturing and supplying the market as it is about differentiating an asset on efficacy and safety. So I think from that perspective, they're an interesting company to be entering here. But I also think it's interesting just because this deal doesn't include an incretin asset. There's no GLP-1, there's no GIP program involved, just around this amylin program. And AbbVie doesn't have any other metabolic programs, let alone obesity programs in their internal clinical pipeline. So as of right now, this is what they're going with. And we haven't seen very many deals that have not included an incretin asset. To me, this kind of says one of two things. Either AbbVie is buying into the potential of amylin as a monotherapy that can fill the need of patients in the market, or they aren't done adding to their obesity pipeline, potentially via another deal or two. I think importantly, it's important to say that I don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive options either. But I do think there's a good reason to think that the first option is a viable sort of strategic decision. If you think about sort of the clinical development in obesity right now, it's what I've kind of heard people term the weight loss Olympics. And this is where every company, often fueled by investor sentiment, is kind of racing to see whose molecule or combinations of molecules can create the biggest numbers in terms of weight loss percentage. We saw this with Novo losing over 150 billion in valuation last December, despite CagriSema showing the highest placebo-adjusted weight loss ever in a phase 3 study. It wasn't the 25% that they had told the market they should expect, and so they got hit pretty hard for it. Some of my conversations recently have really led me to kind of think that I don't think it's always going to be this Olympic-style approach in obesity. I don't think we're always going to be racing to see who gets the biggest number. Because if you look at, epidemiology studies of obesity, there's around 20 to 30% of the population that fits into this severe obesity category, which is typically, people use BMI north of 35 as the way of kind of marking that out. These are kind of individuals that you would think would benefit from a high efficacy therapeutic that can generate 25, 30% or more of weight loss. Those are patients that really need that big, high number. But you still have 70 to 80% of the population that needs to lose weight to improve their health outcomes, but they're probably not going to need a 25% or more weight loss. I think we saw this in the CagriSema trial design, where more than half of patients didn't even get to the highest dose because they found a medium dose that worked well enough for them that they didn't need to push higher. So I think what that shows is that there is a potential opportunity where you could have a large portion of patients who, to reach their optimal weight, maybe they only need 15%, maybe they only need, less than 20% to get there. That's where I think this amylin opportunity potentially comes in, because if you could deliver Wegovy-like weight loss, so around like 15% or more, with a more tolerable profile, the potential for higher quality weight loss through more lean mass retention. Again, I think they still need to show all this in the clinic, but if you have that sort of product profile, I think there's a pretty decent argument for an amylin monotherapy strategy being pretty interesting.
Stephen, can you talk a little bit more about the differentiation potential of this mechanism? Is it all around tolerability? Is it quality of fat loss? What do you expect?
Yeah, so I think it is largely around tolerability. So if you even look back at the CagriSema, the first phase 3 data, that trial had the combination arm, but then they also had monotherapy arms for both the GLP-1 and the amylin. And cagrilintide was the, worst performing of those three in terms of weight loss. So it showed, I think, about 12% weight loss at 68 weeks. But it also had the best tolerability profile of those three. And we've seen that replicated in other amylin monotherapy studies as well. I believe Zealand reported 33% GI effects, but all of them were mild, I think, except for one. So it's been sort of a common theme that amylin doesn't necessarily have the same level of GI tolerability issues to deal with. And then on top of that, you have sort of growing evidence that suggests that by targeting amylin, you trigger, essentially resensitizes the body to leptin, and leptin sort of maintains that adiposity signal for patients. So your body knows that there are still fat cells there to be used. And that's something that kind of gets lost in normal obese patients. And GLP, the incretins don't really impact that. Whereas amylin sort of resensitizes the body essentially to using fat that's stored. That's where you can get this preferential fat mass loss versus lean mass. And then on top of that, another sort of growing thing that I think people have talked a bit more about now is the different way in which amylin and incretin sort of can impact your loss of appetite, the anorexic effect. So the way it was described to me by one person was that if you're on an amylin agonist, you make yourself a sandwich, you eat half of the sandwich, and you just feel full. You just decide, well, I don't need the other half of the sandwich. On the flip side, with people that are on GLP-1s, the description that can happen is you can start to basically, you look at the sandwich and you're like, oh, I don't want any food. You basically are turned off by food, which I don't know, food's pretty important for, our survival. So it doesn't seem like that's a thing you'd want to chronically be feeling like you hate food. So I think there are some smaller things that, it'll be interesting to see how these companies try and tease out these differentiators. I think it makes for a very interesting profile and one that I could see as a good strategy moving forward.
Clearly, obesity is such a huge market, and that's the draw. But I'm wondering if there's any discussion yet about precision medicine here, like because they have slightly different mechanisms and not everybody does respond to GLP-1, say, is there an opportunity to have different responsive patients? Is anybody even talking about that or not?
I think there is talk, but I think you probably right now the demand is so high. I don't know if there's an incentive, right, for companies to go the precision route just yet. When you can make something and you know that for most patients it's going to work and you just let them cycle through therapies to find something that works for them. I don't yet see from the company side, what the driver is for them to take that route. There are people thinking about it for sure. We've had those conversations, but I don't think the market is dictating a move in that direction just as of yet. But it will be interesting, though. It'll be interesting to see what AbbVie decides sort of moving here, kind of going forward. Going down a slightly different path than Selena, obviously it was the Rare Disease Day last Friday. And so aptly, we had a guest commentary that was looking at some of the challenges that face early stage rare disease drug developers in the US. Can you kind of lay out for us what the problem was that this group said they were sort of experiencing and then what the solutions are that they were proposing?
Yeah, well, okay. So obviously we've covered numerous issues that can make rare disease drug development difficult over the years. And I don't know, this one was kind of a new one to me. Maybe it shouldn't have been. But so this was authored by Casper Root, who is CEO of Curalis Corp, which is a biotech developing antisense therapies for neurodegenerative diseases. And he's gotten together with about a dozen other biotechs and formed a consortium. And they're all experiencing similar issues, which is at the transition from preclinical to clinical. And some of them, and others outside this consortium, have actually found that what it takes to get into the clinic can be so hard and fraught with challenges that they're just taking their phase 1 trials elsewhere. And so there's a situation developing where investors put their money into a US company. US company spends that money somewhere else to run its phase 1 trials. And eventually they do bring them back to the US for the later stage trials. So American patients are, not getting access early on to those experimental therapies. And in rare diseases where there aren't that many patients, and so often so many of them are desperate for any kind of option, experimental or not, that's kind of a big deal. And so some of the challenges they outlined were like safety margins. So for genetic therapies, FDA will often require very large safety margins throughout the clinical development path of a genetic medicine, rather than, a typical like large margin applied to the starting dose. And that becomes prohibitive. That's just one example of a reason why you get these INDs on hold. And so the consortium, basically they started a dialogue with Congress, they started a dialogue with FDA and any other organization that might be able to help here. And they've made 3 specific requests, mostly for FDA's new rare disease innovation hub. So that was something FDA recently launched. It's still kind of forming up, and everybody kind of wants to see what it's going to do, how it's going to interact with the other offices over there. And they would like to influence it early on to make this transition to the clinic a bit easier. So they've asked for better dialogue with FDA. So they're people will say that there is more opportunity for dialogue with FDA early than there used to be. But once you get written feedback from the agency, it can be very hard to go back to them and say, well, we disagree with this point or that point. Those opportunities are still kind of rare. So they're asking for an early phase risk benefit assessment that's really calibrated to disease severity in a way that it isn't always now, to help set the context for what sorts of risks the agency might be willing to take. They've asked for a dedicated work stream for specific guidance development and FDA training created for preclinical and IND development phases. In addition to pre-IND meetings and interact meetings, they want to be able to have more dialogue after they receive that written feedback. And they would really like that rare disease hub to get involved and consult prior to the FDA's written feedback. And then the third thing, there is a program called START, Support for Clinical Trials Advancing Rare Disease Therapeutics. I think is what that acronym stands for. But it opens up sort of new and efficient channels for a sponsor communicating with the agency. But it just currently has a limited scope. And so they see this vehicle, the expansion of START, as something that could be really useful in this across rare diseases broadly. So that's another thing they've called for.
Yeah, no, so I read this over the weekend, Selena. I did think it all seemed very reasonable. I mean, obviously, anytime you can increase, that level of communication between regulators and industry, it's largely got to be a good thing, I guess. And this, I think, goes beyond the scope of what they were writing about. But I couldn't help but think to myself, like, this is great, but is FDA going to have enough resources to do this sort of thing going forward, or at least in the near term? And that's maybe a conversation that goes a little bit beyond what we were aiming for today, but hard not to apply that.
It's difficult right now to demand anything of FDA, of an FDA who has, exactly. It's
other than just reviewing BLAs and NDAs, I think that's probably the most that we can hope for at the moment.
On the other hand, maybe at some point, if the dust starts to settle, we'll see.
Sure.
This rare disease hub is going to take some kind of form. So I think that was really the argument for just getting this message out now, because they want to, at some point, it's going to be more clear how that hub is going to serve companies and patients, and getting in at the ground level to kind of influence it does make some sense.
Sure. Great. Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Selena. As I said, that story is also up and available on biocentury.com. I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you very much for joining us. You can tune in to our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, which is out this Thursday and features executive editor Jeff Cranmer in conversation with Zahid Monir of BNP Paribas, discussing pharma M&A, PE's growing role in biotech deals, and the biotech financing environment. If you like the show, please don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment or review. You can find all of these stories at biocenturypodcast.com. Thanks for tuning in. We will catch you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.